Thank you for joining Books in Common Northwest tonight for this event with Leah Thomas and Kate Center to discuss Leah's new book, The Intersectional Environmentalist: How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. I'm Lane Jacobson, the owner of Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon, and Books in Common Northwest is a virtual event series presented by my bookstore, as well as Country Bookshelf in Bozeman, Montana, and Madison Books in Seattle, Washington. Before I properly introduce our guests this evening, I just wanted to go over a couple housekeeping items. If you're having any technical difficulties, we recommend just exiting and then re-entering the Zoom session. And if that doesn't work, this event is also streaming at the Books in Common Northwest YouTube page, which is also where you can find a recording of this event after it concludes. For any audio issues, we recommend plugging in some headphones, as that usually does the trick. And if that doesn't work, again, head over to the YouTube page. And also a reminder that this is a shared creative space, and we ask that everyone in attendance be respectful of other attendees. Any offensive behavior or questions will result in being kicked out of the session. There is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen where you can submit your own questions and vote on other questions that you'd most like to hear answered. We'll get to as many as time allows, and we'll also be dropping links into the chat throughout the evening where you can purchase Leah's book. And with all that out of the way, I got through that a lot faster than I normally do. I'm going to introduce our guests for the evening and then pass things off to them. Kate Center is an environmentalist based in Portland, Oregon. She has spent 15 years advocating for environmental justice at home and around the world. She brings attention to these issues through her personal blog and social media channels, where she writes essays, deep dives into current events, and is well known for publishing reviews on climate fiction and environmental nonfiction. The center of this activism is rooted in prioritizing the intersection between our choices and their environmental impact. Kate's educational background is in urban development and policy, and her work focuses on renewable policy and large-scale development. In her free time, you'll find her tucked away in the woods with her dog, George, who is very cute, and you can find him on her Instagram, which we'll drop into the chat later as well. Leah Thomas is an intersectional environmental activist and eco-communicator based in Southern California. She's passionate about advocating for and exploring the relationship between social justice and environmentalism, and was the first to define the term intersectional environmentalism. She is the founder of the Intersectional Environmentalist platform, and her articles on this topic have appeared in Vogue, Elle, The Good Trade, and Youth to the People, and she has been featured in Harper's Bazaar, W Magazine, Domino, Goop, Fashionista, BuzzFeed, and numerous podcasts. She has a BS in Environmental Science and Policy from Chapman University and worked for the National Park Service and Patagonia headquarters before pursuing activism full-time. Without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to our guests this evening, and then I'll be back later in the evening to field questions from the audience and ask some questions of my own. Kate, Leah, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi. Thanks so much for having us, Lane. Okay, so obviously Leah is like amazing. She has a lot of amazing credentials on her resume, but I wanted to kind of pop into, I guess, the more personal side of my own relationship with Leah. I went to my personal Instagram account because they have that nifty little feature where you can kind of see how long you've been following someone now. And it seems that I've been admiring Leah since late 2018, which seems like a long time, but not so much. But over those years, I have learned so much. I think a lot of my activism was not nearly as advanced or progressive as I had initially thought before I did follow her. And I think bordering on equal importance is that, Leah's work has served as a really constant reminder of the most important pieces of activism to keep top of mind. And on the flip side, how to kind of unpack the privilege that allows like me or anyone else to kind of ever forget those pieces of activism. So with all of that said, I feel so honored to sit across from you virtually or just at all. I'm just really, this is like such a cool experience. And I want to thank Lane for inviting me and you for, sitting down with me, because I know it'll be just as educational for me as any attendee. So having noted that, my intro to you was on social media. I'm kind of curious, and I would love to know, like, what was the catalyzing moment for you to choose to write the book?
Well, thank you so much. And also, you're the coolest. And I love that you've been following me since 2018, because I used to post about like acai bowls, and somehow that turned into like climate justice and intersectional environmentalism. But yeah, just to kick it off, you're saying I got so distracted. So the question was, how do I use social media for activism?
So I know in the preface you could actually talk to that a bit, or talk to the audience a bit about that, kind of like how you got to, from posting acai bowls to like hundreds of thousands of followers. I would love to hear more about that, but also kind of what was like the catalyst for you choosing to move to book format and have this amazing resource and tool guide for all of us?
Yeah, so I started Green Girl Leah, which was previously Green Girl Food. I think it may have been 2016 or 2017. And initially, I wanted it to be kind of a digital portfolio because I was graduating from college and I wanted to, work in the realm of environmental communications. And then over time, I started posting about just going on hikes and being outdoors and different sustainability tips. And I started to find this audience of other Black environmentalists and sustainability people that were saying, oh, hey, we should kind of create an online community together. Or, hey, I'm Black in this nonprofit or at this organization, and it's so cool to see you out here doing things. I'm doing things. So really early on, I kind of saw the power of social media to build these sort of niche audiences, because I was living in Orange County, and then I lived in Ventura, and quite frankly, there weren't a whole lot of people who looked like me. So I was able to connect with other like-minded environmentalists through the internet, and then eventually meeting them in real life. And over time, after working at Patagonia and some other spaces, there were a lot of social justice movements that were starting to take off. So namely the Black Lives Matter movement. And the more I heard about racial injustices happening, the more I kind of leaned on the environmental community to start speaking up about it. But there were a lot of people who weren't really also talking about environmental justice as much as they were talking about conservation issues, and I started to feel alone. But I remembered the power of the internet and how I was able to find that community. So I knew, these people are out there. I can feel it. I know that I'm not alone. So maybe I can start using my social media channel to raise awareness about environmental justice and the ways that social justice and environmentalism intersect in a way that's not shame-based or anything like that, but just accessible for anyone who wants to learn. And through that, I was able to start Intersectional Environmentalist, which I'll get to a little bit later, and then also do exactly what I set out to do, find a community of like-minded environmentalists around the world who are also really passionate about protecting people and planet. And I learned, I was never really alone. I was just living in Ventura. And even that, there's people in Ventura who, are into environmental justice too. So, yeah.
Well, I feel that your work is just a really compelling example as to why individual action can lead to systemic change. I feel like that there's kind of a lot of argument against emphasis on individual action versus, just because it kind of erases the pressure on corporations and government to take responsibility for the moment that we're in and the crisis that we're in. And I was wondering how you feel, individual action plays a role in our activism.
Yeah, sometimes I hear these competing ideals of like, it's individual action, it's, systems change. And both of these things are really important. And I think that's the beauty of nuance and intersectional environmentalism, that two things can coexist and be true at the same time. And while there are systems that need to change, individual actions can add up and lead to systems change. And we can kind of put pressure on corporations and government entities if us as individuals unite. And then I think individual action is also really important, because sometimes with an issue as big as the climate crisis, we need to have some sense of control of like, hey, maybe I can do something, because it feels debilitating when you feel like, nothing I do matters. And I want to make sure people feel optimistic and hopeful. So I would say individual action is so important. And it might seem slow. I know bureaucracy is really slow sometimes, but it does add up and lead to change.
I love that answer a lot. So I guess kind of before we dig in as a primer, because I know many attending haven't had a chance to kind of get their hands on the book yet, I was hoping you would define intersectionality and also intersectional environmentalism.
Yeah, so intersectional theory is something that was created by Kimberly Crenshaw. And sometimes people, use it maybe out of context, but I'm also maybe using it out of its original context. And Kimberly Crenshaw is a law professor and has a professor in so many other things. And back in the day, not that long ago, the 90s, she was analyzing different court cases and seeing the ways that people's overlapping identities might lead to loopholes in the law. So as an example, there was a case with General Motors where all of the Black women specifically were fired, and the white women were not fired, and the Black men were not fired. But because Black women weren't necessarily a protected class, the court dismissed the case because they said it's not a civil rights issue because there are Black men who still have jobs. And this isn't gender-based discrimination or violating any sort of laws here because white women still have jobs. But because of that, people who had overlapping identities and compounding factors that may have contributed to the outcome of that decision, there was kind of a loophole in the law and them not being protected. And intersectional theory doesn't argue that you have to make these really specific, protected classes or anything, but just consider the ways that compounding factors might lead to a certain outcome. So intersectional theory goes beyond just those legal cases, but that's its origin, just making sure you consider the ways that things intersect. And I think it goes to this quote that I love by Audre Lorde, that there's no single issue because we don't live single issue lives, if that makes sense. So if you're looking at something like environmentalism, and if you might say, environmentalism exists over here, and economic inequality exists over here, and racial equality exists way back there, they're overlapping. And while they might be different fields of study, there's definitely things that intersect. Like when we're thinking about protecting endangered salmon or something like that, we should also think about if there are indigenous communities that might be relying on that endangered salmon and how they're impacted. We should also think about economic implications if there are fishermen who are relying on that salmon for their livelihoods. And then we can also look at other environmental things beyond just the salmon and what's causing it. Is the waterway polluted? How is that impacting farms, etc.? So really thinking as comprehensively as possible, not meaning you have to address all of those things at once, but considering them can lead to more comprehensive and intersectional approaches to solving environmental issues. And by not considering it, you might have to circle back a little bit later. So in a nutshell, intersectional environmentalism is really just considering those compounding factors and who is being impacted the most by a variety of different environmental injustices, and making sure you take that into consideration when proposing climate solutions.
This is a good segue into this next question, because you write that social justice action and environmental advocacy are once again, and your historical context was the civil rights movement and Earth Day, the first Earth Day, are once again kind of in alignment, so that, we once again undermine both movements by keeping them separate. So I was hoping you could speak to the importance of breaking down those silos and kind of aligning under that one common goal that you note.
Yeah, and I think I want to reiterate that there's beauty and specialization. So it's not saying that everyone has to just be like, I'm solving every issue at once, but just acknowledging that problems are complex and interconnected, and we can all play a role in figuring out some piece of that, but that these problems don't exist, separately. And I like that you mentioned the civil rights and the Earth Day movement, because that was something I had to look back on, because I saw a lot of climate movements currently kind of existing very separately from a lot of social justice movements, whether we're talking about, the Women's March, the Stop Asian Hate movement, Pride, Black Lives Matter, and then environmentalism is like way over here and usually centers on the climate crisis or conservation. And back in the day, not that long ago, but during the civil rights movement, we had a similar thing happen where, the Earth Day movement started happening after the civil rights movement, and they really adopted or appropriated a lot of the techniques that they were using, like, doing different public demonstrations and protests. But that movement was primarily middle class and white, not everybody. And because it wasn't inclusive, then there was an environmental justice movement of the 80s that really tried to be intersectional in nature, but it didn't have the same support as the Earth Day movement. So I think in the future, we can better show up as environmentalists for environmental justice movements and initiatives.
I have to admit that I fall victim to that siloing quite often. And I was even kind of reflecting back on a lot of the anti-racism books I've been reading or the environmental books I've been reading, and really coming down to just a handful of books that I have on my shelf out of the hundreds that really, go into the intersectionality. And again, the way that you kind of outline it is just so accessible. So again, just a little plug, if you haven't purchased the book and you're here, please buy the book. I have read it twice and I'm still learning from it. So kind of moving on, I think that globally a catch-all phrase that's often used is those causing the least amount of planetary harm are suffering the most severe effects. And this is 100% through and through true, but it's often said without a lot of defining features. And I think that just proliferates, those detrimental inequities. And I think you do an incredible job in this book of not only quantifying those burdens that are often left unnamed, but also kind of breaking it down by community as well, which I found very helpful. And I was hoping that you may want to share some of those facts with attendees and maybe kind of illuminate those instances or just expound on the topic.
Absolutely. So there's a section in the book, because I'm definitely a numbers person and numbers don't lie. So there's a section in the book that's specifically on data, and this is more so focused on the United States, but there is a version of the book that's releasing for Australia and the UK. And it looks at, the African-American community, the Latinx community, the Asian community, Indigenous communities in the United States, and different environmental hazards that they might face or things that are unique to these communities. And I think things that stuck out to me especially was something called a pollution burden. So African Americans have a 2.5 times pollution burden, which means that they experience 2.5 times more pollution than they cause. And white Americans are actually experiencing the opposite. So not a pollution burden, where they experience less pollution than they cause on a daily basis. And another thing that I found with pollution was that African Americans, around 71%, live in counties that are in violation of federal air quality standards. And you also see very similar demographics for Latinx communities. And then even when you're looking at white communities, it's over 20%. So it's quite startling that so many people are living with this much pollution. But whether we're talking about air pollution, water pollution, things like the presence of trees, who would have thought, it's really closely connected to both income and race. And those things off the bat might seem okay, well, trees are pretty to look at, but why do we need them? For various reasons, tree cover really helps prevent things like heat stroke. So, it's really important. And then we're seeing an increase of heat stroke in communities that are in more urban environments because they're living in kind of like heat islands where they just don't have enough trees. And then, of course, we need trees to sequester and take in carbon. But I won't ramble off too many more numbers, but the more I dug in the data, and this data is very accessible, it's from the Environmental Protection Agency and several other agencies. It just keeps showing how different communities are really disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards and injustices.
Okay, I'm going to make you ramble like a little bit more because you do talk extensively about, widespread instances of environmental racism across the US, because this is the US version. And I think most people can maybe name like the Flint crisis, like the water crisis there, right? But they may not necessarily be able to discuss the details or even maybe took in the details. And so I was kind of hoping that you would talk about the cause and effect of one of those instances. It could be Flint if you wanted. I know you discuss it in this, but maybe then also how it was corrected or the obstacles that are still standing in the way of that correction.
Yeah, and I think Flint is a really good, well, horrible, but good example of not thinking about problems as comprehensively as possible. Initially, when the local government decided to they decided it was a cost saving measure for them. They decided to like switch the pipes or something like that with the water, and it would save them a certain amount of money because the other pipes they found were like leaking or something like that. I need to get back into the details, but they decided to make a switch as a cost saving measure, even though I believe it would have cost under $300,000 to just correct the problem, and then no one would have had lead in their water in Flint. But they were saying, we could save money. This is an easy fix to the water problem. Let's just put it through another pipe. Bada bing, bada bang. And then after that, they found out like, oh, there's actually lead and all these horrible things in these pipes that we decided to switch to because of a cost saving measure, which again is like economic policy decisions, but not considering the environmental impacts or doing an environmental assessment of those pipes or thinking about health issues that might happen. So that was really startling. And it shows how these decisions that aren't comprehensive or intersectional in nature can lead to devastating health impacts, because having that much lead in your water, as protesters in Flint talked about, it's really horrible for especially childhood development and their brains and so many other things. But Flint, can we say that it's been fixed? I think even though it has garnered so much national attention, it was really slow to fix things. They started giving people water bottles and things like that, but it took years and years and years to kind of correct the water. And there are still some people in Flint that are saying that they don't have clean water. And that is really concerning to me, because if that case got so much national attention but still took a long time, what about the other communities that might have fracking fluid in their water and they're not getting national attention? Is it going to be fixed? But I think the more people know about it, the easier it will be to prevent instances like that.
And I think that kind of leads to a whole nother discussion that is too much for tonight, but the responsibility of, the media and journalists to continue allowing that to be reported on and making it a pervasive headline, because it dominated the headlines at one point, but now we never hear about it. And it's also still an issue. So I'm kind of wondering, are there would you want to talk about any other systemic drivers that might be behind barriers to achieving environmental justice?
That's a really good question. There's so many, but I also have a tremendous amount of hope. So I think one of the biggest barriers is a lack of accessible knowledge, which is why I started Intersectional Environmentalist, and I wanted to meet people where they're at. Environmental justice data has been around since the 80s and before, but you have to deep dive and search for it, or even in college, you have to specialize in environmental justice or take that class. And the reality is that's not everyone. That's not the everyday person that's able to do that. And even though I have a background in environmental science, like if the goal is to make sure people have a safe and healthy living environment, and to, I don't know, save the planet, then we need to get as many people as possible. The climate movement can't just be driven by climate scientists who are holding this information, because we've seen what happens when this isn't accessible. Again, data has been around about where toxic waste sites are and the discrepancies in water and air pollution since the 80s. But most people have no idea. And I think for me, I had this realization because I thought that, asthma, it's hereditary. My sister has it, my cousins have it, everybody has it. And I remember hearing, Black people, just a lot of Black people have asthma, it's hereditary. And then realizing like, oh my God, the area that I'm living in has insane amounts of air pollution, and this smell by the highway that we just kind of ignore is some landfill that's been leaching materials and like horrible things into this waterway. And then I looked at a map of Superfund sites that have toxic waste and was like, oh my God, there's so many people who are living in, counties and communities that are surrounded in environmental hazards, but they just have no idea. So
Right.
I think one of the most important things is finding ways to get this information and data to people really accessibly, whether that's over social media, which I think is the easiest thing to do to reach as many people as possible. And then later kind of updating curriculums, and hopefully journalists will also talk about environmental injustice a little bit more.
Right. And I mean, if otherwise we're just going to continue to exacerbate these issues, especially as, more climate events become increasingly more common. And also, for anyone who doesn't know, if you don't follow Leah, she has a Patreon. Just an FYI, you can support her that way as well. If you find value in her social, find her on Patreon. Speaking of her social, it's very chock full of ways to live sustainably, which is why I followed you in the first place, because I was kind of moving into that direction. I had done a lot of reading, and I was like, wow, every single step I take in this world has, wide-ranging impact. So how can I start living a little more responsibly? And with her wisdom specifically, it was always the topic of inclusivity was, always a part of that conversation. And I find that accessibility and disability are not always included in discussions of sustainability. And you do such a great job of touching on this, not only on socials, but obviously also in this book, and kind of, dissecting the general environmental factors and food apartheid and water contamination, as we've discussed. And I was wondering if you kind of have some key advice on inclusivity, with regard to the sustainability conversation for people who are entering that realm.
Yeah, I think one of the most empowering things for me, because when I started entering the sustainability space and it was kind of positioned as you had to buy your way into sustainability. Like, okay, you need to get this glass Tupperware set and all these expensive mason jars. You got to drive the electric car. You got to get the electric bike, like all of these sorts of things. Or you need to have like 5 t-shirts only that are $200 each, and they're from a sustainably, ethically made thing. And I just remember walking into that space as a college student, working a couple jobs, not having money to do any of that. And I just felt so defeated. But something that I learned over time was just, hey, my grandma's actually really sustainable. Even though she doesn't use that terminology, her garden is an organic garden, and she reuses like plastic Tupperware containers forever and ever. And she reuses her plastic bags, and she repairs things and recycles things, even if she isn't using that terminology. And that made me feel empowered. I didn't have to subscribe to a kind of consumer-driven take on sustainability that was kind of dominating social media. I was able to find empowerment of what my family did, my ancestors did, and also things that I was already doing that was sustainable, and then just slowly building up from there. So I would suggest that people do that deep dive. Like, is there anything that your parents did or your grandparents did that could also be considered sustainability? Are there things that you do now without even knowing it? Because I think you'll be like, you know what? I've been doing this. I can continue to do more. And then just continuously adding different things. So yeah, that's a place to start, kind of with those affirmations and looking back on your history.
Yeah, because using what you have is more sustainable than buying something green. I always feel like that is lost in conversation. I feel sustainability is like also levied as an argument against fast fashion, and you have an entire section kind of dedicated to that. And I think it's really important to unpack how rapid consumption of apparel specifically impacts people and the planet.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed this chapter, and well, yeah, I wrote the book, but like I really like this chapter. And there's so much nuance to it. Like, I used to work at Patagonia headquarters, and to be completely honest, when I was working there, I could not afford those puffer jackets if it wasn't for my 70% off discount. And even though it's made sustainably and ethically, I think there are a lot of accessibility issues there. So that's one thing that I'll kind of circle back to, but I'll start with kind of the issue. So when you're thinking about the true cost of an item at, H&M, you might find a $5 t-shirt and think, oh my God, this is such, a steal. And you look at Patagonia and you see a similar t-shirt that's like $45. And the decision is so easy to just go with the $5 t-shirt from the fast fashion company. And then I think a lot of people might not be aware of why it costs $5, because usually they're using exploitative practices. So they're working with, unregulated garment factories. They're not paying people a living wage. Sometimes they're paying people pennies a day, if that. Also, a lot of facilities are just dropping toxic dyes into the ocean and different waterways and polluting water. And unfortunately, because of these terrible working conditions, there was a garment factory collapse that happened in Bangladesh, and there's been many instances like that. So there's a lot of really messed up things and cutting corners when it comes to the fast fashion industry. But another thing that I will say is that the system is imperfect, and I want to not shame individuals who are participating in that broken system and shame the corporations that have an ability to change this, because a lot of sustainable fashion is ungodly expensive. And especially when people are really wealthy and they're telling people, I only buy fair trade and I buy ethically and I do this, but I spent $200 on a t-shirt. It's like, well, that's not accessible. And then even when you're talking about thrifting and things like that, I don't know. I don't think that everyone only has to thrift. Like, if they want to buy something new, I think that's okay every now and again. I love thrifting. So there's not a perfect solution because there's imperfect systems, but I think it is important for people to understand why fast fashion is so inexpensive, because of those corners that are being cut. And if they can, to try to make decisions where they aren't supporting the fast fashion industry. But if they're not in a position to do that, considering thrifting and mending what you already have, and then not shopping at fast fashion stores a lot.
Sure.
And if you still have to, then, maybe like that's okay too, because again, it's the corporation that needs to change, but I wouldn't encourage that.
Yeah. And if you do have to go buy the $5 t-shirt, you may just get years of use out of it, which is equally as great, in my opinion. The climate movement often leaves out voices from areas most impacted by the climate crisis. And I want to focus more on the policymaking side. I'm wondering, what is your hope for policymakers moving forward in terms of how they have these conversations and how they're talking about policy, at the table?
Lately, I've had a lot more hope in local policy than I do in federal policy. And I think it's just so rewarding. Like, you can have some pretty cool changes happen by going to like a city council meeting or something like that. Like if you're like, there need to be more trees in my neighborhood, like you probably talk to people locally and maybe get those trees in your neighborhood. So that is something that gives me a lot of hope. But when it comes to federal policy, I am seeing some strides. It's really great that there's an environmental justice committee or council within the White House. It's one of the first. They're operating with a budget of like around $50 million or more. So I believe that they're going to do some really cool things, and I have hope there. Also, the awareness about climate justice is increasing. I remember I was on Instagram and the White House made a video that was titled Intersectionality in the Environment, and I almost like lost my mind. So yeah, I think public awareness is starting to take off about this concept, and people are saying, oh, I didn't realize that this was environmental injustice, that there's a landfill or this really smelly toxic waste site or something, or oh, there is a toxic waste site. So there is more awareness, and I think that will start trickling into policy, but we'll just have to wait and see.
This is kind of a tangent, but as awareness, as our awareness increases and privilege starts to become more topical and addressed and kind of acknowledged, on behalf of people like myself, I'm wondering, has that kind of shifted your activism at all? Like from, I guess I can't really define any ways because you are doing your activism, but I'm just wondering if it has kind of changed at all in the last, year or two.
Yeah, absolutely. I think curriculums have been the fastest to adopt. And also, I don't know why it looks so like hazy in my room. I think it's just because the sun is setting. But yeah, I think there are a lot of academic institutions and teachers and students that are really quickly updating their curriculums. I remember I was giving a talk at a school and they're like, oh yeah, we had to read something about environmental justice like during the first week of school. And even 2 years ago, there would be a lot of environmental science students that would say, I never had to learn about this. I learned about the Clean Air Act, I learned about recycling, I learned about the climate science, carbon sequestration, but who's Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice? And now more people are understanding those things. So that does give me a lot of hope on the educational front. I also think it would be really hard to find a climate justice or any climate organization that would say anti-racism or social justice is not a part of our mission. I think they wouldn't publicly say that, because even organizations like the Wilderness Society now, or the Sierra Club, or WWF, or PETA. I remember during 2020, I got the phone calls. They were trying to update their missions, get on board, etc. And some of that, was genuine. Some of it, who knows, maybe was just trying to catch up with like social justice washing, etc. But I think that public pressure of talking about this in 2020 really made a difference. And we're seeing environmental organizations start talking about environmentalism and protecting both people and the planet. So yeah, I do have a lot of hope that things are changing.
That's awesome. Sorry, kind of jumped around a bit. Okay, so speaking of policy, you break down, a lot of instances of environmental advocacy leading to implementation of environmental policy. But as we've discussed here, and as you discussed in your book, the problem is that those instances were and are majority white-led, meaning that the improvements have excluded the voices of the underrepresented and the people of color. So when looking at calls for the Green New Deal, I am kind of curious, do you see weaknesses with, just kind of like that outlined policy as is, or, does it still look exclusionary to you?
Yeah, so the Green New Deal specifically.
Sure. Yeah. I'm just in terms of like a future policy that it seems that the world is kind of vying for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd be curious. I don't know. I think a lot of people see the Green New Deal as something that was very like pie in the sky. And really, when it comes to like, should we stop polluting the earth? to make sure we save it. It's like, I don't think anything can be too pie in the sky, but in some ways I do think it is really symbolic, and it's something that maybe politicians understood that this maybe is not going to get passed right now. But it was one of those, if you shoot for the moon, you might land on a star, and landing on a star is still, a step in the right direction and progress over perfection. And sometimes, politicians have a bit of a PR stunt when it comes to proposing specific policy. But I think we are landing on stars of the Green New Deal, because we're starting to see more environmental justice policies that are being enacted locally. And then we're also, like I said, seeing one of the first environmental justice councils. We're seeing decisions to allocate $50 million to environmental justice efforts around the country. We're seeing places in California give land back or sell land back to Indigenous communities. So things that people would say, oh, giving land back, that's never going to happen. It is happening. And I think that's really cool.
Absolutely. I'm going to kind of move it to something a little more personal to me. So something that I often push to the back of my mind is the environmental impact of green energy. I work specifically, a lot of the policy I deal with is with regard to solar development. And I know the embodied carbon of, the solar panel, and I know the energy used to manufacture a solar panel, but I also know the carbon that comes from, the actual use of it. But I think something I like to ignore, and I don't like to, that's a bad example, but something I tend to ignore is the extraction that is required, for the creation and the displacement that comes from that extraction. And it's really easy to just kind of yell, about all of those things with regard to fossil fuels, but not so much green energy, because people see it as the path forward in the future. And you have a whole section dedicated to, the dark side of green energy, which I'd love for you to discuss here. But I'm also kind of wondering, because I compartmentalize those so much, but I'm just kind of wondering, how do you, balance the positive impacts of green energy, but also understand the degradation of the planet it brings? And how do you talk about that?
Yeah, it's difficult at times because I have a hybrid electric vehicle and I have an electric bike, things that are using lithium ion batteries. But I think it's also really important to understand the whole picture, like we were talking about earlier. And when I was diving into it, even just seeing the displacement of so many Indigenous people, or even harm caused because of lithium mining, because it's kind of this lithium gold rush that's happening right now, and people are trying to extract as much as they can. And most of lithium mines are in, or lithium salt mines are in Indigenous communities globally. There has to be other solutions that are available. And I think part of that is kind of like climate reparations. Like if you are going into Indigenous lands to extract a ton of lithium, that doesn't really look much different than going into Indigenous lands to extract oil and gas. And even though maybe lithium is better for the environment when it's in an electric vehicle or on a plane, it's still extracting from Indigenous communities, and we can learn from things of the past that didn't go so well to implement into lithium mining here. Or I know there are talks about finding other places in New Zealand and Australia and in the United States. I don't know if it was Arizona or something like that, where people can also obtain lithium. So this is a really hard question because there isn't a perfect solution here. I do think it's really important to move to a green energy transition, but I don't think we can do that without climate reparations. And just really quickly, there was a Shell executive that came to one of my book talks the other day, and I was really shocked. And then there was also a BP person in the audience at the same time. And they kept asking me questions at the end, and they were like, how do we unite with the climate activists? Because we at Shell want to start investing in green energy. And it scared me, because what's happening is big oil knows they're on their way out, and they're starting to monopolize the wind energy, the lithium industry, etc. So Shell is working on its like climate rebrand. And what I told them is exactly what I'm telling you. You can't do this. Environmentalists are not going to want to work with you if there's no accountability and if there's no climate reparations. There have been so many people and our literal planet that has been harmed by these extractive industries, and we can't just brush over it because we're like, oh, you're investing billions in green energy. That's great. But how are people going to be protected in the process? So that's just something that I'm always thinking about.
And with that transition, from one extractive industry to another, but green energy also comes with the transition of subsidies that they qualify for. So I have a lot of mean words to say. Lane, I'm going to ask one more question, then you can have it. So if
please ask.
Okay. Well, actually, so you shared some posts about conflicts in Ukraine and other parts of the world. And I think something that is often missed in a lot of headlines outside of course, what you're writing, is the intersection between resource-driven conflict and environmental justice. And I was wondering if you could expound on that at all.
Absolutely. So I think a lot of refugee crises and humanitarian crises come because of environmental injustices, whether those are specifically connected to climate change or something else. So when we're looking at different wars, sometimes it's because of a lack of resources. People don't have water. We see that happening in Syria during a time of drought. Times of drought and not having water and not having food leads to increased conflict over these resources, etc. And we're seeing that even more when the climate crisis is at play, because there will be more areas that are having natural disasters, more areas that are impacted by drought or irregular, weather conditions. And I think internationally, we should start preparing for that to be the case. Because who's responsible if there are climate refugees that have to flee a small island nation that is completely submerged, even though they didn't cause the climate crisis in large part because they're so teeny tiny and mostly sustainable? Is the United States responsible? Are countries that have, polluted the earth and kind of led to the climate crisis responsible? And that just raises the question again of climate reparations and how we're going to prepare for impending refugee crises because of the climate crisis. And then I won't get into it too much, but even looking at Russia and oil and fights for resources, it's just all interconnected and intertwined.
Okay, so my last formal question, I may have more pop up in the next discussion part, but if you were to kind of sum up how ally communities can best use their privilege to advocate for the people and planet, what would you tell us?
I would say talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to them about this stuff. Because I think sometimes, especially for allies, so if the truth of the matter is, even when I'm talking to my family or someone else who is Black, it's not always the case, but my family and my friends and my community, they trust me. So they're more likely to listen to me than kind of an outsider that's coming in. And I can also use my privilege to advocate for other marginalized groups of people. So also talking about Indigenous land sovereignty, et cetera. That's my responsibility as an ally to those communities to spread it far and wide. And I think when we're talking about white people that want to help with racial justice, talking to your friends and family in a way that that they'll understand. I'm not saying coming in there, not guns blazing, but coming in and just spewing stuff at them, but them and what they might be receptive to listening to. So telling them about, did you know there's a landfill over here and this landfill is doing this, that, and the other? Did you know there's this thing that's happening? Kind of starting those conversations with people so you can spread awareness about this topic. And then another way to help is just do everything you can to amplify different initiatives by people of color in the environmental space, queer people in the environmental space, disabled communities in the environmental space. So whether that's having those conversations with your friends, sharing on social media, attending meetings if you can, and asking them, what can I do? Instead of just proposing a solution, genuinely saying, what can I do? How can I best participate? And going from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I'm
thank
gonna mute
you.
myself now, Leah. Or excuse me, Lane.
If you have something to add to any of the questions in our conversation, we have some time for some audience questions and also a question or two that I have. Just so everybody knows, you can drop all your questions into the Q&A down there at the bottom. And we kind of have touched on most of these subjects that are in the audience questions as they asked them, and then we like naturally got there, but we'll circle back to them anyway, because I think they're interesting. We can probably add some more stuff to it. Holly asks, how do you find out about the hidden stories, the Flints that don't make the news? And then she cites thinking Catherine Coleman Flowers' waste, which I don't know, or I'm not familiar with that, but cites that as an example.
Yeah, it can be really difficult because when things don't get media attention, it's kind of hard for people to kind of stumble across it. And I think the best way to do that is to find environmental justice organizations in your town. And that can be done through a quick search of just say you're in, Ventura, saying Environmental Justice Organization Ventura. There's also Patagonia had something called Patagonia Action Works. I don't know if they still have it, but you could find organizations in your community. And then doing that Google search, I remember I did it. I found an organization that was called like Cause 805 or like the Environmental Justice Alliance of Santa Barbara. I had no idea that they were around. And connecting with them, whether it was following them on social media or going to a protest with them, I was able to find out what was happening specifically in my community. And I think that's a really good place to start. And I was shocked. I found out that there was this like energy facility that was building right across from a school within, I think it was like not very far away. I remember they had children, like 50 kids, hold hands just to show how close this energy facility was to the school that was there. And I went to that protest, and had I not been following that group, I would have had no idea. I honestly wouldn't have had any idea. And unfortunately, it didn't get a lot of media attention, but it started to get more local attention and people started to, pay attention. So I would say that Google search of environmental justice organizations in my community, and then just seeing what's going on around your area.
Yeah, and I will also add that within the book itself, there are a ton of great resources, not specifically to like ongoing crises that are happening, but resources to places that will then inform you about those things.
I was also going to just add that, books like A Terrible Thing to Waste or There's Something in the Water, those books all have, pages and pages of resources that they've pulled from. And I like to, when I'm done reading it, I'll go through and look at each of those resources, pull it up and add it to an Excel spreadsheet that I, if I find it really useful for future reference.
Totally. Okay, so another question. We talked about what you're feeling hopeful about in the policy sphere or in the political sphere, but what is something that makes you feel hopeful about the environmental movement in general in its current state?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say just how quickly people kind of picked up intersectional environmentalism or environmental justice. It's only been 2 years. And like I said, I don't know every single environmental organization, but from Fridays to Future rebranding as like an intersectional climate organization or seeing mission statements be updated, never in a million years, like who would have thought that the Sierra Club would talk about John Muir's legacy and how they can hold complex feelings as an organization, and they can be very proud of his conservation efforts, but also not endorse some of his anti-Indigenous, rhetoric. And I thought that they have a really great statement on that, which showed like you don't have to forget your history, but adding those other components to it to tell a truer history and story of environmentalism that has nuance is really good for the organization, so it can root itself in accountability. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I'm also seeing a lot of wealth redistribution. So there are a lot of organizations like WWF, et cetera, that are trying their best to reallocate funds to smaller environmental justice organizations that aren't operating with $200 million budgets, et cetera. So time will tell if some of it is social justice washing and what's not. But what makes me optimistic is the general awareness that's spreading.
I think that's a great answer. And what you talked about with John Muir's legacy reminds me of recently the newest, it's sort of a segue, but the newest Nick Offerman book of like Parks and Rec, Nick Offerman. He talks a lot about that, the dualism between the sort of Muir approach to conservation and like Teddy Roosevelt, where the national parks are the country's crown jewels and they need to be preserved as is, and whatever. But there were communities that were living within those areas sustainably for generations before the United States came up and claimed them as their own, as their crown jewels and stuff. So anyway, another question from the audience. The white-led environmental movement also seems to depend on a kind of saviorism, literally, quote, saving the whales. Can you talk about how to keep that approach from causing harm as white activists spend more time in environmental justice spaces?
Snaps to the person who asked this question. I think that just hits the nail right on the head. Yeah, we don't have to be saviors. Not me, not any of us. People are not, I don't know. So when we're talking about people of color, I think it's also really important to talk about resilience. And this is something that I'm thinking about in my own language that I use. So not saying marginalized communities as often, I do still use that terminology, but these are also resilient communities that are in need of amplification, et cetera. And just painting people as like victims that need to be saved by you isn't really a really great dynamic, because they're also human beings just like you, and they're not in need of saviors. They're in need of resources, because oftentimes they can be the bearers of their own solutions. They've already created solutions, but they don't have mainstream media attention or awareness or resources to be able to, enact some of the things that they're proposing. So I think staying away from saviorism is good. And saviorism is rampant in philanthropy and conservation, because conservation is philanthropic in nature. And even when we're talking about conservation in Africa, it gives me the ick, because when we're looking at Africa, a place that has been so impacted by colonization and the extraction of resources from Africa, and then to have, white folks come in and not acknowledge any of that history of extraction, and then say, we're here to save the wildlife. And when they're saying, we're here to save the African wildlife, or we're here to save the African children, but they're not acknowledging all these systems that are in play that led to the endangerment of so many, the wildlife that they're trying to save and the people that they're trying to save. So I don't know. I think philanthropy is something that makes people feel really good about themselves at times, thinking that they can save things, and it's problematic in a lot of different ways.
So I think that's a good one to end the sort of policy-ish discussion, but I do have one question that I really want to ask, and I know, so Kate asked you early on about kind of why the book, but I'm really curious about the how of the book. And what I kind of mean by that is this book, for being so small, both in like trim size and page count, you packed a lot in here without making it, you know, inaccessible or feeling really daunting. And I'm just curious about what you envisioned the book to be and the process that you went through to turn it into what it is, because it really is like part textbook, part, you know, it does seem, hopefully not off base, saying like it is inspired by social media and Instagram and bite-sized things. And you also, as I'm like rambling a little bit, you did such a great job of making the process of reading this feel like being part of a community. There's an energy in it that I think is really admirable that you don't find in a lot of these things. And you also do a great job of lifting up other voices with this platform. That, you know, a solid number of the words in this are quotes from other people and whole sections like that, which I really love as well. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about all of that stuff.
Yeah, so I started writing the proposal for this book at the same time that I was building Intersectional Environmentalist. So that's something that a lot of people don't know, but I was furloughed from my job at Patagonia at the time, and I decided to just not come back, even though they had offered for me to come back. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to try my hardest to see if I can write a book and start this organization and just, you know, try. And there had been many failed book proposals over like 4 years prior that I had tried on a variety of different topics. And I had been freelance writing for a little while. And when suddenly there was this momentum of hundreds of thousands of people saying, what is intersectional environmentalism that you're talking about? What is environmental justice? I could have had a moment where I said, oh, these people should know about environmental justice. You know, it's been around for a really long time. But instead, getting off of my high horse and saying, when is this going to happen again? That there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that are saying, I want to learn about intersectional theory. I want to learn a starting point, people who are in the environmental community and that they're, you know, not in the environmental community. So I just thought, how can I create as many accessible resources as possible? So that was kind of the goal of our Instagram, of how can we meet the demand of all these people who want this information, and then how can we also design it in a way that's really accessible. And I remember early on we were kind of working with different fonts, working with different colors, and that's why this book is so colorful. And I started to find, okay, the algorithm performs really well even if you're saying things like dismantle systems of oppression and you put a rainbow on it. More people are going to share it. More people are going to just feel really warm about it, and they're going to really get into it. And then I think with the book, it's dense, but it's kind of it's meant to be a starting point for a lot of people, or a supplementary text, because I know with Instagram, sometimes you lose the reader's attention at times. So I wanted to switch to different topics so I can pack as much in there as possible, and then leave the reader the responsibility to continue on their journey after this book. And then selfishly, I wrote this book for my younger self when I was a Black environmental science student. And I thought about all the things that I wanted to know going into my studies, like the mother and father of environmental justice, ecofeminism, sociology. So I put a lot of things in here, like the Horatio Alger myth, like things that I learned in college that I wish I would have had in like one textbook. So, yeah.
Yeah, you've done a really fantastic job. Okay, so I think we're going to do 2 more questions, one from the audience, and I have another one. So from the audience, it's really incredible to see your passion for environmental justice and how you show it to others. How do you keep this passion up and keep yourself from getting burnt out?
This is a great question, because sometimes I do get burnt out, just like all of us. I think if you're really passionate about something, especially when the stakes are high, like the climate crisis, like, will we have an Earth to inhabit? Like, that's a really high stake. And I try not to think about that every single day. And then I lean into the power of community, because if I'm tired, this isn't a one-person show. And you see that in the book. There's over 30 contributors, people who are mentors to me, other activists that I look up to. We have to do everything in community with other people. And I think of community like a circle. Like if one person has to pop out for a moment and practice self-care and just chill and do their thing, guess what? It's still a circle. If 1 or 2 or 3 people leave, it's still a circle. It can just get a little bit smaller, but it's still going to be effective. And then by having that community, when you pop in and if someone else needs to pop out, then everything's going to be okay because you're all playing a unique role and it can never be a one-person show. So I think thinking of it that way and not this kind of martyrdom of like, I have to save the planet. Like there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are playing a role to make this planet a better place. So chill when you need to. I'm not saying just completely disconnect, but prioritize your self-care. And another thing I learned from a group called the NAP Ministries, which is all about how napping and resting is a revolutionary act, which is also something the Black Panthers pioneered. People don't know that self-care as a concept came from the Black Panthers. Look into it. But the reason the Black Panthers started talking about it is because they were, fighting really hard back in the day. And they realized that if everyone was getting burnt out and not taking care of themselves, then they couldn't continue to do the work that they were doing. And that practicing self-care, finding joy, finding rest is a radical act in a system that's trying to prevent you from finding rest and finding joy. So when I think of it that way, okay, me being happy and caring for myself is another way to kind of stick it to the man. I'm going to do that. And I hope all of you do that too, because it is a revolutionary act in this world that we're living in.
I think that's a fantastic answer. And I love the framing it as a circle, because that circles back to what Kate was asking earlier too, is this sort of push and pull between individual action and feeling like you're not doing enough, or you're doing everything and nobody else around you is doing enough. And I think that is like many of these things, just a very simple but elegant solution that I really like. Okay, so the last question that I have for you is kind of a personal one that I've been trying to figure out exactly like the best way to frame it. And you do talk about this a little bit in your book. And for myself as a mixed race and queer person, and a lot of my colleagues in the book industry, who are people of color or queer or what have you, engaging with a predominantly white, cis, straight industry, we find a lot of like push and pull and code switching and all that stuff. And I'm just really curious, for you as a Black woman, engaging in this activism sphere and stuff, and how you've held on to your different identities, and if you've experienced some like push and pull and code switching and all that stuff, and just what that whole experience has been like for you.
Absolutely. I have experienced that. And yeah, I code switch every single day. And part of it, I think, is a survival tactic that a lot of people of color do at times, navigating different systems, especially the publishing industry. And something that I struggle with is I don't like that maybe some of my success is connected to some white people viewing me as palatable, and they won't listen to other Black people who are being more direct, as they should, or that they associate negative stereotypes with. And that's something that really makes me mad, and it really makes me upset, because it's like, okay, I talk like this because I have anxiety. So sometimes I talk slowly and it sounds a bit poetic, but I'm still angry. I am mad at the systems of oppression that are happening. And I don't like how people at times turn their brains off to people who are expressing anger that needs to be expressed. And I struggle with that. But then again, I also know that, okay, maybe this is for the greater good in some ways, of if I can be in these spaces and get people to listen to me in some ways, even if they're listening because they believe there's a certain degree of palatability, which is really messed up. How can I use this opportunity to amplify as many voices as I can? And that's why this book is jam-packed with so many people, because when that door opened in the publishing world, I didn't know that door would ever open up, but it was there, and I was going to do as much as I can with whatever small amount of power I had in that moment. And I would encourage, and I think a lot of other people of color and marginalized groups of people, we do that. It's a part of community care. If a door opens, then we're going to open that door for as many people as possible. But yeah, it's really complicated. And I think people can observe, the court case that's happening right now as a perfect example of code switching with the judge. I forget her name. She's amazing. We both have sister locks. She's incredible. And if you watch that, just seeing the ways that Black women and people of color have to navigate and be calm, even though we might want to be angry, but just understanding the second that we turn to anger, all of a sudden we lose some sort of palatability thing to a lot of white folks. And I think it's a really difficult thing to do, as many of us know. But part of it is like playing the game for the greater good when you can.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. And I really appreciate the way that you talk about this, both for yourself and just in general within the book, and even acknowledging that, you grew up in some very white spaces. So you learned how to code switch. Yeah, so anyway, yeah, just something for all of us to keep in mind. Kate, did you have any last questions or anything? I'll see if we've got, we do have another question from the audience if you're game for one more question. Cool. Who are your heroes in the environmental movement, and or who are some contemporary activists that you admire?
So yesterday I flew to the Bay Area to meet Park Ranger Betty Reed Thoskin. She's 100 years old, and she is a Black woman that became Park Ranger at 85 years old. And she is definitely one of my role models. She is the coolest person in the world, and her nickname is Badass Betty. So I would look her up because, yeah, she's the oldest living Park Ranger and happens to be a Black woman. Someone else is Teresa Baker, who is a dear friend of mine and also started the Outdoor CEO Diversity Pledge alongside some of my other friends, Jose Gonzalez, who founded Latino Outdoors, my friend Wynn Wiley, also known as Patty Gonia. They just founded an organization called the Outdoor Oath. I could go on and on and on, but I feel like so many of my friends are my heroes. And also lately, I've been thinking about Harriet Tubman and how she was an environmentalist in her own right, and thinking about African Americans that look to the stars and they look to nature to find freedom. And I think that's something that I want to explore a bit more, about how so many African Americans had this connection with nature to find freedom. And that to me makes them an environmental hero.
Fantastic answer. And I think that that's a great note for us to end on. Thank you both so much for joining us this evening. This has been a really thought-provoking and educational and energizing, for me at least, conversation to listen in on. And I'm sure that I speak for a lot of people in the audience as well. Thank you everybody for tuning in. And the book is Intersectional Environmentalist. It's fantastic. Check it out and follow both of these amazing women on Instagram. It's definitely worth it. Thank you again, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you.